Guided reading. Women's suffrage in Europe. The First World War created social and political upheavals in Europe, and women were a significant part of the workforce in many countries during the war. This gave them a newfound sense of empowerment, and many began to demand greater political representation. Women's organizations like the German Women's Party in Germany, the French Union for Women's Suffrage, and the National Council of French Women in France lobbied for the right to vote and greater representation in politics. Women's suffrage in Germany was granted in 1918, and in France, women gained the right to vote in 1944. In Germany, the Weimar Constitution was passed in 1919, which established equality between men and women in all areas of life. Marie Jukacs, a leading figure in the German women's movement, founded the German Women's Party in 1919 and became the first woman to address the German parliament. In addition to advocating for women's suffrage, Jukacs and her party fought for equal pay for women and for women to have access to education and the professions. In France, feminist organizations had been established as early as the mid-19th century, but women's suffrage was not granted until after World War II. The National Council of French Women was founded in 1901 and became a leading force in the fight for women's rights. They lobbied for the right to vote, the right to divorce, and access to education for women. Simone de Beauvoir, a French feminist and philosopher, published her groundbreaking book The Second Sex in 1949, which challenged traditional notions of gender roles and sparked feminist movements around the world. Notable figures. Marie Jukacs founded the German Women's Party in 1919 and became the first woman to address the German parliament. Simone de Beauvoir, a French feminist and philosopher, published The Second Sex in 1949. Check for understanding. What were some of the women's organizations in Europe that lobbied for women's rights during this time period? When was women's suffrage granted in Germany and France? Who was Marie Jukacs, and what contributions did she make to the German women's movement? What were some of the rights that the National Council of French Women lobbied for? Women's suffrage in the United Kingdom. The suffrage movement in the United Kingdom was led by the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, founded by Emmeline Pankhurst in 1903. The Representation of the People Act was passed in 1918, which gave some women the right to vote. However, it was not until 1928 that women in the UK gained equal voting rights with men. The Pankhurst family was central to the WSPU's leadership, with Emmeline Pankhurst, her daughters Christabel and Sylvia, and her son Adela all playing active roles. The actions of the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, were controversial for several reasons. Firstly, the WSPU used militant and aggressive tactics, which included hunger strikes, arson, and vandalism, to draw attention to their cause. Their actions were seen as disruptive and even dangerous by some, leading to their arrests, imprisonment, and force-feeding. The government and many members of the public were opposed to their tactics, which they viewed as a threat to law and order. In addition to their militant tactics, the WSPU also organized peaceful demonstrations and marches, which gained the support of many women and men who believed in their cause. Notable figures. Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia were influential leaders of the WSPU. Check for understanding. Who founded the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, in the United Kingdom? When was the Representation of the People Act passed in the UK, and what did it do for women's suffrage? What were some of the militant tactics used by the WSPU to draw attention to their cause? How were the actions of the WSPU perceived by the government and some members of the public? Women's suffrage in the United States. The suffrage movement in the United States was led by women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who founded the National Woman Suffrage Association in 1869. The movement gained momentum in the early 1900s, with the formation of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, led by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. The Congressional Union later became the National Woman's Party, which used militant tactics such as picketing the White House and hunger strikes to pressure President Wilson to support women's suffrage. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed in 1920, which granted women the right to vote. This was a significant achievement for the suffrage movement, which had been fighting for women's rights for over 70 years. In addition to the suffrage movement, the post-World War I period saw significant social changes for women in the United States. The war had led to a shortage of men in the workforce, and women were often called upon to fill the gaps. This led to the perception that women could handle more significant responsibilities, and many began to question traditional gender roles. Women gained greater opportunities in the workplace, with many taking on roles previously reserved for men. However, discrimination and unequal pay persisted, and it was not until later in the 20th century that significant progress was made in addressing these issues. Notable figures: Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were influential leaders of the suffrage movement in the United States. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns were also key figures who organized protests and picketed the White House to pressure President Wilson to support women's suffrage. Check for understanding. When was the National Woman Suffrage Association founded? Who were the leaders of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, and what tactics did they use? What was the National Woman's Party, and how did it differ from the National Woman Suffrage Association? What opportunities did women gain in the workplace after World War I, and what challenges did they still face? Conclusion: the post-World War I period saw significant social changes for women, with movements for women's suffrage gaining momentum in Europe, the United Kingdom, and the United States. These movements were led by notable figures who fought for women's rights and equality, paving the way for progress in politics, the workplace, and society as a whole. Women gained greater political power and representation, and their voices were heard in politics for the first time. In the workplace, women began to gain greater opportunities, with many taking on roles previously reserved for men. The legacy of these movements continues today, with ongoing efforts to achieve gender equality and address issues such as the gender pay gap and workplace discrimination. The impact of these social changes cannot be overstated, and they continue to shape the world we live in today.